History tells the story of the world and of our lives. Sometimes that history goes bump in the night. Broadcasting from the center of oddity and the supernatural in Central Florida, it's the History Goes Bump podcast.
Hello, you spooktacular people. Welcome to this 560th episode of the History Goes Bump podcast. Ghost tours for the theater of the mind. I'm your host, Diane.
And this is Kelly.
Kelly, on this episode, people not only get to listen to me with a cold, so excuse my voice, but we're doing one of their favorite topics.
Yes, we are.
Haunted cemeteries. This is Haunted Cemeteries number 30. On this episode, we're going to share 7 haunted cemeteries from around the world. Before we get into that, we want to welcome into the Spooktacular crew, Ralph, Kim, Rika with 2 Ks, and Dalton.
Thank you so much for joining the Spooktacular crew.
And now this moment in Oddity.
The Giant Causeway is located in Northern Ireland and is believed to be 60 million years old. This is a unique formation of hexagonal basalt stones that became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1986. This is referred to as a causeway because the tops of the columns form stepping stones that lead down to the sea and go under it. All of the stones seem to have been cut in the shapes they have, whether they have 4 or more sides, but scientists claim that these stones were formed from a volcanic fissure eruption. The use of giant in the name indicates that legends are connected to this site. One story claims that there was an Irish giant named Finn McCool and a Scottish giant named Benidonner. The two were mighty rivals, and Finn built the causeway so that he could have a meeting with Benidonner. After the meeting, Benidonner ripped up the causeway and ran back to Scotland. For his part, Finn McCool left behind his giant boot, which is fossilized at the Giant's Causeway in Bay of the Giant. Causeway guides told a different story in the 1700s, and this story was also written out as a poem in 1830. Finn had fallen in love with a Scottish maiden, but he couldn't reach her, so he decided to build the causeway. He was making good progress, but it was stopped by his grandmother, who didn't want him going after the maiden because she feared losing him to Scotland. She used magic to create a storm that destroyed the causeway. Finn built it again, and she destroyed it again. This went on, and on this final night, the storm lashed out as Finn built. He was exhausted by the time he got to the other side and fell into the maiden's arms and died. His grandmother was horrified that her magic led to his death, and she turned it to stone and continues to stand at the causeway today. The legends are fun, but a giant more than likely didn't build the causeway. Regardless, the formation certainly is odd.
Grab your slippers, hot chocolate, flashlight, and maybe even that baseball bat.
And now this month in history.
In the month of October, on the 10th in 1940, St. Pauls Cathedral was bombed. King Ethelbert I dedicated the first Christian cathedral to be built here in 604 AD. He dedicated that cathedral to St. Paul. It burned to the ground later and was rebuilt, and then destroyed by the Vikings in 962. A third cathedral was also burned down in 1087. The fourth cathedral stood for many years, but burned up in the Great Fire of London in 1666. English architect Sir Christopher Wren built the fifth and final cathedral in the Baroque design, and crowned it with a beautiful dome. Wren considered it his masterpiece, and he was buried inside it. During the Battle of Britain in World War II, the German Luftwaffe bombed Britain heavily. A nighttime raid was launched on October 10th, and a Nazi bomb went through the dome and left the high altar in ruin. The image of St. Paul's in the midst of smoke and fire inspired the British people. The cathedral survived the Blitz, and the bells rang out in 1944 to celebrate the liberation of Paris. and again in 1945 at the end of the war in Europe, with services attended by 35,000 people.
A bench hewn from natural wood that is located in one of the featured cemeteries reads, "Here I sit, broken-hearted, thinking about our dearly departed." And that is why we have cemeteries, to remember our dearly departed family and friends. For those of us that wander these cities of the dead, we make new friends along the way as we stop and read a headstone here and there, a life remembered for a brief moment. We give that to the dead when we stop and care. And in some cemeteries, our efforts do not go in vain, as we are watched and surveyed from beyond the veil. On this Haunted Cemeteries episode, we feature haunted cemeteries in Arizona, Alabama, Ontario, Canada, Prague, Czech Republic, South Dakota, and 2 St. Marys Churchyards in London, Britain.
We're going to start with Evergreen Mortuary and Cemetery, which was founded in 1907 on 110 acres outside the city of Tucson to replace the original city cemetery known as Court Street Cemetery. That cemetery was open from 1875 to 1907. When it closed, the bodies were moved to Evergreen. The process took 20 years. Remains from another cemetery named Presidio were also relocated here. This means that many of the early pioneers of Tucson are buried in Evergreen. The cemetery is surrounded by mountains and features a lush landscape with many trees that have attracted a wide variety of birds through the years, so it's been listed as a bird sanctuary by the Audubon Society of Tucson. So this puts it really high on our list, Kelly, because we love bird watching. Evergreen Mortuary was opened in 1974 to make the cemetery a one-stop shop. The North Star Memorial Group acquired the property in 2014.
One-stop shop. Some of the notable people buried here are Jacob Mansfield, who started the first public library in the territory, and Thomas Jeffords, who was a U.S. Army scout and blood brother to Apache leader Cochise, who helped negotiate a treaty with the Apache. The Drockman family were pioneers who came to Tucson from California. Philip Drockman traveled as steerage to New York in 1852, and through several years made his way to the territory of Arizona. There, he opened a dry goods store with his friend Joseph Goldwater and got involved in real estate. By 1881, he owned a saloon, and a few years later, he had a cigar shop. And he got involved in politics. Drockman died in Tucson in 1889. He was buried in the Masonic plot at Evergreen Cemetery. His son Mose got involved in Tucson real estate and politics, following in his father's footsteps. He too is buried at Evergreen.
The Evergreen Cemetery page on Facebook shares this about Maria Wakefield Fish, who was buried at the cemetery in 1909. Governor Safford invited Maria to come to Arizona and inaugurate the public schools in Tucson. There were no railroads, the desert stretched out desolate, and hostile Indians ranged the country. Maria braved the dangers and came and took the post and opened the public schools of Tucson. She was the pioneer that opened up the splendid vista of education to boys and girls of today. Wakefield Middle School was named for her. She was also the first American woman married in Tucson in 1874.
Many people believe this cemetery is one of the most haunted places in Tucson. There is the disembodied sound of children laughing and playing that is heard. A woman was walking through the cemetery one day and felt a sudden and forceful yank of her hair. There was no one near her. There can be an eerie silence about the place at times. More quiet than any cemetery should be. No birds sing, no bugs flit, and no wind courses through the trees.
Dun, dun, dun. Next, we have Hodges Cemetery. This is a family cemetery in Alabama that dates back to 1887 and is on land owned originally by W.L. Hodges near the border with Brookside. There are around 135 graves here, and despite being a small graveyard, it is apparently very active with spirits. That could be because the cemetery regularly gets disturbed by recreational ATV riders and other trespassers. People driving by the cemetery claim that something bangs against their car. Ghostly hands and faces appear on the windows of their cars as well. Shadow figures dart among the tombstones and strange noises are heard. And there have been claims of sightings of a wolf with glowing red eyes.
Next up is Drummond Hill. The land of the Haudenosaunee was once where Drummond Hill Cemetery now sits. Haudenosaunee means people of the Longhouse. This land sits in the Niagara Falls area in Ontario, Canada. A settler named Christopher Buckner bought 400 acres of land in 1799 from his father-in-law, James Forsyth. On the top of the hill there, he designed a burial ground. The earliest burial dates to 1797. During the War of 1812, the Battle of Lundy Lane was fought. Lieutenant Governor Gordon Drummond took command of the British forces, and his goal was to drive the Americans from the west bank of the Niagara. Brigadier General Winfield Scott led the Americans, and they emerged from a forest right in the path of Drummond. At first, Scott's men took a big beating, but then one regiment moved to flank the left side of the British, which surprised 2 battalions. Another American regiment arrived, and one brigade under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Miller released a devastating attack on the British and earned the title of the Hero of Lundy's Lane. Several attacks later and many deaths later, the battle ended in a draw. The hill was named for Drummond.
One of the notable people buried here is Burr Lockhart Plato, who was a slave in West Virginia. He escaped and used the Underground Railroad to get to Canada in 1856. He settled in Niagara Falls and grew in prominence there until he was elected as a councillor in 1886, one of the first black politicians in Canada. Laura Secord is also buried here. During the War of 1812, she walked over 20 miles from American-occupied territory to get a message to the British warning them of an impending American attack. This was despite her father being a patriot. Her husband was a loyalist. The information helped the British and the Mohawk repel the attack. Her effort was largely forgotten until 1860, when she was formally thanked and awarded £100 by the Prince of Wales, Edward. Schools have been named for her, a museum was set up for her, there are monuments and memorial coins and stamps, and even chocolates were made in her honor. Her legend has reached almost mythic levels. I'm sure it's gone from she walked 20 miles to she walked over 200 miles in snow uphill
Both ways.
Get that message there. And that must have been interesting at holidays to have dad and husband at the same table together.
Oh my, yes.
Definitely don't talk politics at the table there.
The main ghosts seen in this cemetery are, of course, soldiers. People have seen the spirits of 5 soldiers in Royal Scots uniforms. They limp across the cemetery. A residual haunting plays out, featuring 3 British soldiers walking towards Lundy House, which was used as a hospital during the war. The sounds of battle are often heard. People claim to feel as though they are being watched. Ghost Walks had taken a group out on their Niagara Ghost Bus tour, and as they exited the cemetery, a woman turned to look back because she felt a cold breeze on her neck and she yelled, "Turn around! Look!" The whole group saw black figures hovering behind graves, and then they just disappeared.
Ooh, you love it when you have a whole group who sees something like that. Too bad they didn't get pictures of it. Next, we have the Bonica Cemetery. This is located in the city of Prague in the Czech Republic, and it was founded in 1909. This was the burial ground for the Bonica Psychiatric Hospital. There are about 4,000 bodies in the cemetery. The grounds of the hospital are very large and described as being more like a village. And that makes sense because a lot of our psychiatric places here or asylums were their own cities. What's interesting about this one? It's still open.
Oh, wow.
The grounds feature a park that is used as a music venue and host for festivals and exhibitions. The main building, which is a Baroque country house, still houses patients. The St. Wenceslas Church had been a church, then a barracks, and a military warehouse. It's open for special occasions now. I've heard that most of it has been gutted in the middle, so it doesn't really look a lot like a church anymore inside. There are also villas, a theater, cafe, and farm. And then there's the abandoned cemetery. Through the years, grave robbers came and took many of the headstones that had metal so that they could sell the metal. So most burials are unmarked. And the cemetery is so overgrown, no one would know it was a cemetery if not for the fence and gate. A small chapel is in ruins with just the outer brick walls still standing. A large cross still sits against a wall. The last burial took place in 1951, and the cemetery was abandoned in 1963.
Before the closure, about 40 patients were buried every year. Some patients with syphilis were treated with blood that was contaminated with malaria.
I've never heard of that treatment before.
Goodness. It was thought that this would give patients fevers that would kill the bacteria. Sometimes it worked, but most ended up dead, especially when the treatment was used for schizophrenia or mania.
Yeah, I don't know how giving somebody malaria is going to treat their schizophrenia.
Yeah. There are also victims from a typhus epidemic and prisoners from World War I. There's only one gravestone here that can be read, and it reads Maria Tuma Reiter, with her death marked as April 1912. She had been 29 years old. She passed from pneumonia, but is believed to not have been a patient, but rather a worker who lived in the cottages nearby with her husband and 2 children. The most notable burial here would be Gavrilo Princip, the assassin of Archduke of Austria Franz Ferdinand. And the possible murderer of a sex worker named Otilia Vranska might be here. Sergeant Pavlicek never confessed to the murder publicly, but he had friends who claimed that he confided to them that he had murdered the woman. Otilia was found cut in half, with her body in 2 different suitcases set with 2 different destinations. The murder was never solved. Pavlicek was admitted to Bonitsa Psychiatric Hospital, and he committed suicide there.
It is said that the cemetery is full of negative energy. Satanic rituals were conducted in years past, and remnants have been left behind like circles of salt. Seances were held for years, as recently as 2008, and this was recorded on security cameras. People claim to hear strange sounds coming from within the cemetery. Unexplained lights are also seen. A legend claims that Maria's gravestone has stayed so nice because her spirit protects it, so most everything is overgrown except for hers. Thieves claimed that when they tried to take her headstone, they were grabbed on the shoulder by a woman who said, "Hey, this is sacred." She might be haunting the cemetery because there is one story that claims that she was admitted to the hospital for wrong reasons and was raped and impregnated, and that the doctor who committed this act killed her during an abortion attempt. There's another story that thieves were carrying a large tombstone out of the cemetery when they were scared by something they saw and dropped it. That headstone now sits near the front gate. And now a little break for a word about one of our sponsors.
And now on to Keystone Cemetery, which is perfectly situated so that Mount Rushmore can be seen from the grounds. The grounds are picturesque, and there's a cute little white chapel. This cemetery is also known as Mountain View Cemetery, and was founded by Patrick F. Hayes in 1900. The first burial was his daughter Catherine, who had died at just 18 months old. Notable burials here include David N. Swansea, who was friends with Charles Rushmore and Gutzon Borglum, and helped with giving Mount Rushmore its name. His wife was Carrie Ingalls. Yes, a member of the Little House on the Prairie family. His son Harold David, Davy Red Swansea, is also buried here and had been a worker at Mount Rushmore. As a side note, Mount Rushmore was built from 1927 to 1941, and 400 workers using ropes and scaffolding moved nearly 450,000 tons of rock, and not one person perished.
Can you imagine? That is amazing to me. Nobody died doing any of that. And a lot of those workers are now buried in this cemetery as well. But because they lived to an older age, not because they died doing it. Also buried at the cemetery is Harry Harden, who was known as Wild Horse. He had a donkey named Sugar Babe, and the two became characters advertising Landstrom's Black Hills gold jewelry. Harden played the part of a bearded prospector. He would tell people he survived the Custer Massacre, but he was born 20 years after the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So if anybody went out and looked at his tombstone, they'd be like, wait a minute, didn't he tell us that he was
Tall tales
there and survived it? But it makes sense. If you're playing a bearded prospector with a donkey named Sugar Babe, you should be telling tall tales. A recent burial in 2005 was for Orville Francis Solway, who was also known as Pahaska. The name means White Hills, and was given to him by Ben Black Elk. Pahaska was an elder of the Oglala Sioux tribe, and he traveled the world as an ambassador for his tribe and the city of Keystone. He won numerous awards for his artwork, which is on display at the Crazy Horse Memorial.
The grave of Robert Bobby Buntrock is here. He was born in Denver in 1952, and his parents moved the family to California when he was 3 years old. They got him signed to an agent, and when he was 7, he landed his first big role on an episode of Wagon Train. When he was 9, he landed his biggest role as Harold Sport Baxter on the sitcom Hazel, starring Shirley Booth. He retired from acting in 1967 when he was 15. The family moved to Keystone, and Bobby died there in 1974 at the age of 21 when his car veered off a bridge under construction and landed in Battle Creek, where he drowned. He was young, making this tragic, but even worse is that his mother met a similar fate just a year before this. And yes, on the same exact bridge.
Isn't that bizarre?
It's terrible.
It makes you hope that his was just an accident and that he didn't purposefully, because his mom had done the same thing, drive off the bridge. And I'm like, I hope they did something with that bridge so that you didn't have people driving off of it anymore. There are stories of spirits in the graveyard. Disembodied and haunting laughter is attributed to Wild Horse Harden. Ghostly apparitions have been spotted standing in the cemetery. Caitlin wrote on B102.7's website, "Friends and I went to the cemetery years ago. I took many pictures with my digital camera and found nothing on the pictures, but I took a video on my cell phone. Unfortunately, I no longer have the video, but after reviewing the video, there's something big and white which shot across the screen of my phone. Also, on our way out, all of our phones stopped working. Said there was service, but when we tried to call out, our phones just shut off." And then finally, we have 2 St. Marys Churchyards, which are over in London. So not a very unique name, I guess. This first one is in Hendon.
A church of some sort had stood on the St. Mary's Churchyard site in Hendon, North London, since Anglo-Saxon times. The original church is thought to have been named for Mary Magdalene by a heretical cult linked to the Knights Templar. This churchyard contains family sepulchres numbered with Roman numerals, and an addition was added between World War I and II for newer burials. It is said that an ancient and horrifying history is part of the churchyard, and may have influenced Bram Stoker's writing of Dracula. The Lloyd's Weekly newspaper reported in 1892 a story that dated back to 1828. A young medical student approached the vicar of St. Mary's Church in 1828 and told him that he desperately needed to get access to his family's vault. The vicar at first refused, but then agreed, saying that he would only open it if the young man promised not to open any coffins. He should have stuck around to supervise, because the young man brought an axe with him and proceeded to chop off the head of his mother's corpse.
I think he did more than just open a coffin.
Slightly. When authorities asked the man why he did this, he claimed that he was dying from a hereditary disease that had also killed her. When the story was shared in the newspaper in 1892, it was opposite a review of the Lyceum Theatre's production of King Lear. At that time, Bram Stoker was the manager of the Lyceum Theatre and probably saw the article. Could this have inspired some of his ideas for Dracula? Van Helsing cut off the head of Lucy after she turned vampire at a churchyard called Kingstead. Its description sounded a lot like St. Mary's Hendon Reading, a lordly death house in a lonely churchyard away from teeming London, where the air is fresh and the sun rises over Hampstead Hill, and where wildflowers grow out of their own accord. When Dracula was published, St. Mary's Churchyard was in the countryside. Today, it has homes all around it.
That'd be very cool if it was something that inspired his writing. That's interesting, but on top of possibly being connected to Dracula, this churchyard is haunted. The disembodied sounds of shuffling have been heard as though a group of phantom monks are walking through the churchyard and in the church. This is heard most often during religious festivals. The sounds of a ghostly choir are heard around the church. Some of it sounds like Benedictine monks chanting, and they would have been here before King Henry VIII dissolved the monastery. So some people might say, well, there wouldn't be any Benedictine monks here. Yep, there were. The manager of Arsenal Football Club before World War II was Herbert Chapman, and he was buried here. His ghost haunts his burial and is said to also show up at the old Highbury Stadium. Guess he's got to coach that one more game or something. And finally, we have St. Mary's Churchyard in Wanstead.
Just as with our other St. Mary's Churchyard, this has had a church and graveyard for at least 800 years, dating back to around 1208. The current church was built in 1787 and designed by architect Thomas Hardwick. This church was made in the Georgian style. The oldest headstone dates to 1685 and is for a man named James Whalley. Notable burials here are the sculptor Joseph Wilton, Royal Navy Vice Admiral Robert Plampin, and Thomas Turpin, allegedly uncle to dastardly Dick Turpin, who is the most famous thug in Essex. Winifred East was the wife of an auctioneer whose decapitated body was found on the Southern Railway between Kidbrooke and Eltham in Wanstead. She was only 28 and her murder was never solved. The Derry Journal of Monday the 18th, March 1929 gave these details. A young man who is known to have entered the carriage in which Mrs. East traveled and left at a later station is being sought by the police. When the driver of the electric train had just passed Kidbrooke Station, he saw in the distance a dark object lying between the two sets of rails. As he came closer, he saw that it was a decapitated body of a woman. He reported the matter to the station master at Well Hall, the next stopping place. After establishing the woman's identity, the police searched the train, in which she was known to have left Barnehurst. And the discovery of a number of her personal belongings under a seat were able to determine the actual compartment in which she traveled. She was buried in St. Marys Churchyard.
There are claims that at least 4 spirits have made this churchyard their home. There's a gray lady here that seems to be looking for her husband. Sightings of her have been reported for nearly 100 years. Dick Turpin must have liked his uncle because it said that he likes to show up in this churchyard every so often. Dick also shows up at St. George's Field in York, close to where he was executed in 1739, and lots of pubs claim to have his ghost too.
He gets around.
Yeah, so he obviously would have liked to go to a lot of different pubs, but I think there's a lot of pubs that like to be able to claim him as theirs. The third spirit seen here is a skeleton who is wheeling along a handcart with a coffin on it, so he seems to be working as a ghostly gravedigger. And there's a lady in white here too, whom seems to be upset that grave robbers took her body. I don't know how they know that, but maybe she's told somebody.
We love cemeteries, especially if they have a haunted reputation. All these cemeteries are unique and interesting. Are they haunted?
That is for you to decide. Well, 7 great cemeteries to check out. And as we're recording, we actually have cemetery bingo going on here in October of 2024.
Yes, we do.
So we know everybody had a lot of fun doing that, because who wouldn't, wandering around a cemetery looking for symbols? Whoever the winner was, we'll know by the time this drops.
That's true.
Received a t-shirt as a reward. We'd love to have you guys check out our website at historygoesbump.com. And if you'd like to leave us some feedback, you can do that at historygoesbump@gmail.com or drop us comments at any of our various social media, whether it's YouTube, Instagram, X, or Facebook.
Yes, indeed. Got a variety to choose from.
We also want to thank everyone for all of your well wishes and good thoughts coming our way as we went through Hurricane Milton. We know a lot of our listeners on the West Coast got hit pretty hard, and there was even those on the East Coast that got hit pretty hard too. And we were sitting watching these tornado warnings.
I mean, it was very scary.
Yeah, down in Port St. Lucie, which should have had nothing happening down there, really. They were barely going to get any of the hurricane coming through there. When that thing whips around, it causes lots of disturbances, and they were just getting tornado warning after tornado warning. And I kept telling Kelly, who was actually still working at the time, she works from home, and I'm watching the TV, I'm watching the computer, and I'm telling her, okay, the tornado warnings are coming up. They're in all of the counties right around us, so probably within the next 30 minutes, we're going to get one. So you're going to have to get off the phone, and we're going to have to get into the master closet, because that's all we got to protect ourselves with. And then I'd be like, nope. Nothing's coming. Okay, there's another one. It's making its way north. We're going to get hit again. Nope, it's not going to get to us.
We were skirted, so.
It totally skirted us. So I don't know what you all believe. I don't like to say, oh, well, God protected us and then he didn't protect these other people.
Right.
But it felt like we had a canopy over our little area here down. It's called Four Corners in Florida because we're at 4 counties. And all those other counties were getting the warnings, but it just went right by the corner where we were at and never even had. We had the most tornado warnings that the state of Florida has ever had, 126, and not one of them was for us, which is the main thing that we usually get during a hurricane.
Right, and something that absolutely terrifies me. I'll take an earthquake over a tornado any day.
Yeah, we don't have a creepy old basement or cellar to go down, which is good because I used to always run up the stairs when I was a kid. I'd go down the basement, then I'd run up the stairs before the boogeyman could get me. So I don't have to worry about that, but it would be kind of nice if the boogeyman, wind, and hurricane and tornadoes, we had a little bit better protection than just a closet.
This is true.
I want to thank you guys for tuning in to this episode. I've been your host, Diane.
And this has been Kelly.
You take care now.
Bye-bye.
This episode is brought to you by our executive producers.
Be sociable. Drop the chain rattling, neck biting, and shape shifting. And join us on Facebook and Twitter at History Goes Bump. Like the page and follow us.
I'm only good if I put my glasses on right instead of on my head.
Does that help you to say the words better? Is that a different language? Pahaska was an elder of the Oglala.
And may have influenced Bram Stoker.
Bram Stoker.
It's not coming out of my mouth. Who was Essex's...
Isn't that fun to say? Essex's?
No, it's not. It's really not. Who was Essex?
Who was the most famous thug in Essex?
Okay, thank you. Who was the most famous thug in Essex?